Hey everybody, it's Jennifer Ryan with Revelation Through History. This is session 4, going through my book that just came out, Revelation Through History. And today's topic, we're going to be touching on 3 more villains, although these villains aren't all in the book of Revelation, but in order to kind of understand the picture of what God was doing during that time, we're going to hit on a couple of other ones. And we're going to be talking about the harlot of Revelation. We're also going to be talking about the abomination of desolation that Jesus talks about in Matthew 24. And then also we're going to talk about the villain of the idea of the end of the world coming during the end times, and they're all to do with each other. You know, that's not really a villain, but it is a villain of God's heart for our generation. So we do need to discuss that and really pick apart what Jesus was talking about and John saw in the visions that he was shown about the hard times coming in their generation. But first, let's talk about the harlot, because she is a main character in the book of Revelation, okay? So she's mostly discussed in Revelation chapter 17 and 18. So let's take a look at some of those, okay? Verses 1 through 3. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication." So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And of course, we talked about the beast and the 7 heads and all of that last week, but we're going to review it again today here in just a minute. But look at this, a great harlot who sits on many waters. So, and the kings of the earth, they committed fornication with her, and, you know, the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So we talked about the symbolism last week, too, to help us understand who the beasts were, that when we see waters and also earth, that is heavy Old Testament symbolism, talking about who the prophecies were aimed at. Waters typically talked about Gentile nations and other lands and different people groups, while earth or land, a lot of times in Old Testament prophecies, it was describing who the prophecy was aimed at. And sometimes God used it to talk about his people, and other times it was used to talk about pagan people or non-Israelite people. So we know that the revelation was aimed at the people who were coming against God's ways. So earth and the context of Revelation had to do with Jerusalem. And this great harlot was working with them, as well as with the 7 heads who were the beasts. So verse 7, but the angel said to me, "Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns." So the angel helped John understand what he was talking about. He didn't just use code words the whole time. John said that it was explained to him, but unless we know that history, it's still going to sound really foolish to us unless we understand the background of it and the context of what he was talking about, which is what I enjoy doing. You know, I like the history stuff, and I want us to see everything that God did. Well, in order to do that, we have to pick apart some of the history. Last week, we talked about the angel telling John, he said, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is to come, who will remain a short time. So looking at history, the first major leaders of the Roman, when it went from a republic and it transitioned into a major world empire, the first 5 were Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. Those were the 5 who had fallen. The one who was at the time that John saw his vision was Nero. He reigned 13 years, and there is a lot of evidence pointing to John receiving his vision and him writing it down while he was banished there by Nero. And this is debated. There's also evidence of him being on there a few decades later by Domitian. The one who would come but would remain a short time, that was Galba. He was the one that ended that 7, there were 7 emperors there, the 6 before him, and Galba was the one that kind of spearheaded the transition into it ending. He was from the area of Spain. He came over, he revolted against Nero, and he was the one to cause the change to happen. And he only lasted for 7 months. So the seven-headed beast, there's the first seven all the way to Galba. The two-headed beast who would come up out of the earth were Vespasian and Titus. And they were the ones who were really in charge during the actual war with the Romans and the Jews that lasted seven years. So all of those clues, unless we know the history, it's very hard to understand it. But those were the seven-headed beast and the two-headed beast. The angel also told John, he said that the harlot was a city. That's in chapter 17, verse 18. And the woman whom you saw is that great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. The kings of the earth, or the kings of Judea, because the revelation was aimed at the Jewish people at that time. And that was who he was talking to. That was who the trouble was going to come to. And they were a part of all of the destruction that was coming to that time. So the woman was the city that was with the Jewish kings of that time. Verse 17:5, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So we spent some time last week also talking about the mark of the beast. Of course, it was supposed to be on the hands and the foreheads of the ones who were loyal to Rome. That was an indicator. But then also, if you read the entire book of Revelation, the marks of God on the foreheads of his people, that was also a theme that went all the way throughout it, and we can't ignore that too. And if we try to understand what the angel was indicating and pointing out, it'll help us to not be afraid of that whole mark of the beast thing that a lot of people get hung up on today, and they're very scared because of it. So the forehead thing, it could have been a reference to the Jewish tradition of the tefillin. The Torah commanded that tefillin, and the Greek word for that is phylacteries, they should be worn as a sign or a remembrance that God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. So a box was placed on the arm while the other was strapped to the head. And this was not a literal thing. I haven't found that it was God was saying, hey, you need to do this. It was just he wanted them to always keep the memory and the stories of what he had done in their thoughts and a part of what they did daily in their lives. He wanted it always there, reminding them and leading them and a part of everything that they were doing. And so the reference to this in the book of Revelation, it was, if you read between the lines, it's like, are you going to remember what Rome is doing? Are you going to pay more attention to the beast and the tribulations that are coming and the system that you have set up? Are you going to remember what I've done and let that guide you and be always a part of your life and in your thoughts? So it's more than just a physical thing that we need to look out for and be afraid of and not be a part of in our society. It's more about remembering God's ways and his heart and not getting caught up in another system. It's all symbolic. Okay. So the harlot, she must be bad, right? Because all of chapter 17 and 18 are dedicated to her. All of 18 talks about the hard times that were coming to her and how she's going to fall and be humiliated and all of that. So chapter 18, verse 20 said, Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. So we need to take this as a clue to be able to figure out who this city is, because this is also debated not just with the futurists, the people that believe that it's all supposed to take place in our future, but also between preterists. So who is the harlot supposed to be, or who was she? Another clue is from Jesus, Matthew 23:37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Now we're going to go into this area of Matthew a little bit more later on in this session to see that Jesus was giving them some very practical advice about the hard times and the destruction of the temple that was going to come in their day. But he was addressing, and the context surrounding all of the scary Matthew 24 prophecies, it has to do with Jerusalem and the temple. And he was saying that Jerusalem was the one who would kill the prophets and stone the ones who were sent to her, which were apostles and what we would label as apostles today. a lot of preterist teachers, or some preterist teachers, would say that the harlot is Rome. And there is some similar features there, and yes, it could be tied to that, especially because we pull on this whole thing that the harlot, going back to the verse in Revelation, the harlot would stone the prophets and the apostles, right? Well, before the Great Fire of Rome happened, which I went into detail about last week, that was the first official Roman policy came about to persecute the Christians. But up until then, there was no policy to persecute Christians in Rome. It only happened during Nero's reign, and that was shortly before the temple's destruction. So it's really hard to say that had always been an issue in Rome, but it was always an issue in Jerusalem. God would try to send them Old Testament prophets, and people always saying, we're not really following God's ways. We need to straighten up. God would bring consequences through other nations and even things going on inside. But the people constantly refused to listen to his word and his prophets. So there was a few exceptions, but for the most part, they always stoned the prophets and rejected God in that. So why is Rome a possibility? There are prophecies in Revelation that talk about the harlot who sat on the 7 mountains. Well, Rome is known as the city on 7 hills, but it's also less known that Jerusalem did too. And so here's a map of the Old Testament Jerusalem and its 7 hills. So it's also known to be sitting on 7 mountains. But to me, that prophecy is more aimed at the mountains being symbolic of kings and leaders and the Roman emperors. And it's not so much a literal thing, even though it can be pointed to a literal thing, because there's the map right there. There are 7 hills in Jerusalem. But harlotry talks more about cheating on God, and Rome technically didn't do that. Okay, Revelation 18:4. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. So God was saying his people were in the harlot, okay? So if the harlot was a city, then his people were in the city. But if you look at the context of when God was calling his people the saints in the rest of the book of Revelation, it was always the ones who kept the testimony of Jesus Christ. It wasn't at this point, and in this context, it wasn't about the Jewish people as a nation or a people group. It was about the people who were keeping the testimony of what Jesus did. So we're going to talk about another very strong subject. I know that in all of these sessions so far, I've kind of chipped away at some traditions and some hard conversations, and I know there's a lot of debates out there, but we're going to do it again. We're going to take another very strong, controversial topic, but I'm helping you point out different perspectives, and even if you don't wind up seeing it my way, if it makes you question a little bit and research it a little bit more, then that's really what I want to do. I want you guys to see different things that God did, because it's always his heart for us to put his thoughts before us in our minds and in everything that we do during the day. Okay, so Paul, he had in the book of Galatians some very strong words against the law. You know, he came against that really hard in a lot of books, but especially in Galatians. So we're going to look at chapter 4, verses 21 through 29. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondwoman, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic. He's saying these things are symbolic right here. For these are 2 covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Okay, let's stop here and talk about it. This is Paul saying that as of right then, when he was talking in his generation, things had changed. Up until that point, yeah, Jerusalem, they were the children of the promise. But he was saying that right now in his day, not in our day, in his day, that Jerusalem had switched and they were the children of Hagar now. They were the children of the flesh, and the children who had become the children of the free woman of the spirit, it had transitioned a little bit. And he was saying that their Jerusalem, as they knew it, it had been corrupted and it was switched. And now the corrupted ones were persecuting the ones of the spirit, but they would eventually have to go. That's what he was saying. Okay, so here it could lead you to think that I am one who believes in replacement theology. I'm going to address that right now. I'm not into the replacement theology idea, but I'm also not into the Zionist way of thinking that it is about Jerusalem lifting her up today. How I see it and how I hope you guys see it is like this. It's always been God, right? He's God, he's creator. It's always been his way. He has tried to get out that he wants to be with us. He wants that relationship. He wants to lead us and be our God and be our spirit and show us the way to live. And the system had risen up, and we put the system above his heart and above his way. But he always warned that he didn't want it that way. He allowed it to help him. He also allowed it to paint a picture of what the ultimate picture, who was Jesus Christ, what he would do. And that helped us to understand, because we could see it in the natural, to understand his heart. But the people through the generations, they allowed it to become corrupted, and they allowed it to be twisted to where it wasn't representing his heart anymore. And it just kept going the wrong direction. God gave them many opportunities to change. It was their choice. Some chose to still listen to him, but the majority of them didn't. And they kept building up the system until it became more and more anti-God, until it had switched. Jesus was always a part of God's plan. It wasn't like it was God's way and then Jesus kind of took it a different direction and we just went the Jesus way and it switched to the Gentiles. I don't think that that's true either. It was always God. It's never been anything but God. We were just lucky enough to be included in that when he came to set up the kingdom and do away with the corrupted system. It worked out for us and the timing of it. But it's always been God and Jesus from the get-go, and Holy Spirit is now with us. We're now walking out the setting up of the way that he always wanted it. So it's not a replacement, like we took the place of the Jews. It was always God's people and always God's heart. And that, to me, that's how he sees it. It's just always been his way. And the ones who choose to be a part of his way, whether it was before Jesus or not, those are his people. And that's the way that I see it. And I think that that's what Paul was saying, was that the old covenant, the old symbols, well, they had just been twisted and God was correcting it because this is his plan. So that's where I stand on that. It's more about heart. It's more about relationship. It's less about people groups, because Paul also points out in other places that there's no man or woman. There's no free or slave, all of that. There's no difference. It's just God's people, God's heart. And those of us that follow that way, well, we're a part of everything. There's no Jew and Gentile anymore. So I hope you guys can see God's heart and not rules and laws and all of that too. All right, so let's keep going a little bit on some other verses about the harlot. Okay, Revelation 18:21. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down, and shall not be found anymore. Well, we know that historically that has been true, that the Romans destroyed the temple so much that it's never actually been found. We can go off of other maps and other indicators that kind of point us to where it really was, that, and there's a lot of theories out there, but it wasn't actually found. The Wailing Wall today was not part of the temple. It was actually a part of what Herod had built way before the temple had ever been destroyed. And that's what we use today as the original ancient, pointing up to the location of the temple. And going back to the different perspective on maybe Rome being the harlot, because Rome was burned too, just a few years before the temple was burned, but it wasn't lost. It was just a huge part of the city had burned, It wasn't lost. It can't. So if that was true, if the prophecy pointed to Rome, then it wouldn't have manifested. Where this prophecy about Babylon or Jerusalem, it has manifested, because the temple was not ever rebuilt in the same place, and it was burned and destroyed completely, even down to the foundation. Let's look at Isaiah 54:5. God said, "For your maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name." There's so many Old Testament verses pointing to God saying that my people, I'm married to my people. They are mine and I am theirs, and I want to be in every part of their lives. And there's so much symbolism involved that he said, yeah, I'm your husband. I made you. I'm your Lord. And that, like, you're everything. We are one together. And he called that for his people. Also, if you look at books like Hosea, chapter 1, 2 through 3, when the Lord began to speak by Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord." So he went to Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So Hosea was a type of prophet who lived the prophecies. He didn't just speak it and write it. He also lived it, and he was performing by living a prophetic drama of what God was saying he was going through, so that Hosea could feel the pain and the heart issues and everything involved in making your life a part of somebody else's life, and then they betray you and walk away from you and constantly just choose other people instead of you. And Hosea lived that, and it was a drama. So God was saying all along, my people, you're not honoring me, you're not following me, you're rejecting me, but I'm your husband. He always brought it back to the harlotry, but Rome was never considered married to God. So technically, they're just like everybody else in the world, and there had been other empires that weren't from that section of the world. They were all doing pagan things, and Rome was never singled out as married to God, even though it had Christians there before the burning of the temple. It wasn't like Jerusalem was. Jerusalem had constantly rejected God. So if Jerusalem was in trouble, then just like with the beast, we should be able to point out some natural things in history that walked out the symbolism that John had seen in the prophecies. We should be able to pinpoint it to the natural too. So I pointed out last week, right, the Roman Empire, it transitioned following the Greek Empire. Rome was a republic up until that time, but it was about the 40s and 30s BC where Rome started rising up and taking over, and they became their own empire that kind of became more powerful than the Greek Empire at that time. Augustus was the main one who stepped up into it, and he was the first official emperor of that time, but he was working with two other guys, Mark Antony and Lepidus, and they were all ruling, the three of them together. Well, during that time was when Herod the Great started rising into power. He was not technically Jewish. He was raised as a Jew and all the Jewish ways, and he was like one of those grafted in kind of people. His people became a part of the Jewish territory, I guess, and he had some connections, and so he started stepping up into the political game and making connections, and he did have connections with Mark Antony and those guys, and he was climbing the ladder, and he did eventually become like a vassal king. He worked for Rome, and he took over as the king, and he ran that area. Well, he was given money because, yeah, he became a puppet to Rome, and so they gave him some money. He started bringing in building projects, and he brought in the employment rate increased, and just some prosperity did come, but he wasn't a very good guy either. So there was that whole, well, you're loyal to Rome, and you're very cruel, and you're evil, and you're not really one of us because you're not a true Jew by blood. And there was a whole lot of tension because they also knew that their day would see the rise of the Messiah, and the Messianic kingdom would be set up. And even though they had their own ideas and expectations of what it would look like, they still believed it, even though God really wasn't going to do it that way. And it was just very tense politically with everything that was going on. So Herod started his dynasty and his kids and relatives, and they kind of all took over and spread out and were running it together through the line. Well, the last of Herod's line to rule was a guy named Agrippa II and his sister Berenice, and they were in charge during the time of the war with the Jews and the Roman. They went up to the very end of that. And of course, they kind of liked their situation with Rome because they were given privileges and they were given money. And no, they didn't want their city to be destroyed, but no, they didn't want to lose what they have. So they were kind of stuck in the middle and they were playing this game. Well, when Titus was in the area and they were getting ready to come against Jerusalem, well, they started communicating more with Agrippa and Berenice and Titus struck up a relationship, and she wound up becoming his mistress. And after the war was over, when Titus went back to co-rule with his dad Vespasian in Rome, Berenice followed him and they kept up that relationship, and she stayed a mistress to him. But then eventually when Titus became emperor, he wanted to please the people, and the people didn't want Berenice, and so he banished her. He got rid of her. So she was a literal in the natural drama of the kings of Judea and the city and the structure of what used to be God's ways. She became a harlot to the beast, and that was a literal thing. It was a symbolic thing. In all ways, it literally happened with the picture of Berenice and Titus. And we know that when the temple was destroyed, the priests and everything, well, they weren't needed anymore, and that whole thing transitioned out, which we're going to talk about more later in another session. But also the line from Herod, it completely changed. It became more controlled by Rome a little bit more closely, and the line from Herod also discontinued. So everything, I mean, in 70 AD, when God came against the system that had been set up, it changed everything. It changed the lines of the kings and the need for the temple, the need for the priests and the leaders of the church, the old way of doing things. It all changed. So we're going to look at Matthew 24 a little bit. And I don't go into this too much in the book. I tried to stay with Revelation, or it would have just been too big of a book. But here we're going to look at some practical things that Jesus said. And if you think about it, there were so many prophecies that we know that we can look back in the Old Testament that pointed to Jesus coming in the flesh and Jesus dying and everything that he did for us to change things, because what Jesus did was huge. It was bigger, and I say it all the time, is that he did so much more than what we give him credit for. It was a lot bigger than what we think. He didn't just live and die and rise from the dead and go to heaven so that we could go and be in heaven with him. I mean, he changed everything, and the amount of change that he needed, meaning getting rid of the corrupt system, the temple, it was no longer needed anymore, because he wanted to write his law on our hearts, and he wanted to do it with us together as truly being one, so Holy Spirit can live in us as the new temple. That was what he wanted, and that was what he intended to set up. And so in order to do that, the old corrupt ways had to go, and it did. We can look back and see it went away completely. And this whole thing about rebuilding the temple, I don't get it, because I really, really believe, okay, we are with him. We're his vessels. We live and allow him to live through us like he's always wanted. It's together and we are one. But God cared about those people of the first century. He cared about them so much that he bent over backwards, getting the word out that destruction was coming, tribulation was coming. And of course, because Jesus came in the flesh, he's the main prophet. He's the guy that, of course, he's going to prophesy that. He's not just going to show us how to live and love and then leave it to the prophets that were coming after him, like Paul and all the other guys. Jesus had to do it too. And he gave the most practical advice to prove that God cared for us that much. It's almost like if we take the Matthew 24 prophecies and we apply it to our future, it's kind of like we're robbing the people of the first century of God's love for them, that it didn't mean anything to them because God's showing us about our future, and he loved them, and we can't underestimate his love for those people that Jesus walked with every day, and he saw, and he had compassion on them, and he healed them, but he also loved them enough to warn them about what was coming, to a lot of them, to their children. The people that walked with Jesus in the flesh, it was their children that saw the most destruction in the war that came, and God loved them too. So we should we keep the principles, of course, because the principles are always, it's about God's heart and that example, but we can't forget that God loved them too. With the Matthew 24 prophecies, a lot of the futurists that think that the New Testament prophecies are talking about our future, they're beginning to see how the war with the Jews and the Romans, it was very important. It happened. We're beginning to see it in history, but it's really just a foreshadowing of what's coming in our future. But that, again, and I said it last week too, that would contradict what Jesus said in Matthew 24 when he gives all that practical advice. In verse 21, he said, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be." And Matthew 24 was all about, it was in the context of the temple and how it was destroyed and how all the stones fell from the foundation, which we're going to look at in just a little bit too. But I did get some timelines because I like timelines and I like to see the big picture and how it played out in history. But I did those for you guys too. And these are a part of my book too, but let's talk about them a little bit, okay? So it was about the year 30, though nobody really knows for sure about when Jesus came and when his ministry started or when he died. It's just around the year 30. Okay, he came, he lived, he had a few years of ministry. He died, and then he rose again. Well, after he rose again, after a little bit, that's when Holy Spirit came at the day of Pentecost. And that's what empowered the people to fulfill the Great Commission. Because his followers, they had 40 years to spread the word that the end was coming. And that was typically one biblical generation was about 40 years. So if the temple was destroyed in the year 70 and Jesus came about the year 30 and Holy Spirit came, that gave them 40 years, and they had one generation to say how the end was coming. And during this time, during those few decades of awesome power and proof and miracles, and they're watching all of the Old Testament prophecies come about and some of the things that Jesus was saying, they're all watching it happen in their lives. Well, the writers of what's now our New Testament, they were encouraging people and prophesying to them and recording everything that was going on. They were coming against some of the beliefs that were coming to spring up, whether they were healthy or not. The authors of our New Testament, those writings began to be written so that we can know exactly what God did today. And we can see, again, keep it in the forefront of our minds, just like he was advising them to do in the book of Revelation, and not forget the things that he did. During the late 30s, not too long after this, well, that's, like I said last week, Caligula came into power in the year 37. And he was the one who set up his own statues in the Temple of Jerusalem. He hated the Jews fiercely, and he started taking over because he didn't want them worshiping their God. He wanted them worshiping him. And that is a part of the prophecies about the beast and how everybody worshiped the beast. Well, it was Caligula, but that was also during the time that the church was just getting off the ground. They were getting organized and figuring things out because everything had changed. And then when Caligula came along into Jerusalem and forced the people to worship, that's when they scattered. And that's when they started going out into all the land to get the word out. The year 64, that was when the official persecution of the Christians began. And that followed the Great Fire of Rome during Nero's reign. Somebody suggested that the Christians, they're weird. Well, they probably did it. And because a lot of people thought Nero was the one that started it, he wanted to get the attention off of himself. And so he went along with it and decided to make the Christians free to persecute. And this, when he died in 68, there was about because the fire started in the summer of 64, there was about 3.5 years that this persecution lasted, which would go with the prophecies of the dragon was given the authority to persecute the saints. All of that fits with what actually happened in history. This was also, because it was a couple of years before the war began, this was a time of turmoil for the Jews. They knew it was the time of their Messiah being set up. They had some very serious expectations that they were willing to die for and to fight to see. They knew their writings, they believed all the prophecies and the symbolism, and they were trying to make it happen. Jesus warned the people in Matthew 24. He said, don't fall for these false messiahs. Okay, so let's look at what he said, verse 23 through 26. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or, look, he is in the inner rooms. Do not believe it. This takes a little bit of explaining, okay? So if you look at even today's Jews, when they explain what a Messiah is, it's not just somebody like a supernatural thing and he fits all of the prophecies right now. Well, he must be it, so we're going to worship him. It is, but it isn't. It's almost like if a man is to fulfill every single prophecy in his life, to be the Messiah, including his death, well, then that person was the Messiah. And that is a big disagreement of why some Jews can't see that Jesus was the fulfillment of all those prophecies, because they have a perspective of the Old Testament prophecies, and Jesus didn't meet those expectations. So to them, he's not the Messiah, just because they don't see it from that perspective. So the Jews at that time, the ones who refused to see Jesus coming and being the Messiah, the ones that knew the Messianic kingdom was still to come in their time because it fit the timing, they were looking for other men. But they couldn't know that the Messiah had come until the man lived and died and fulfilled all the prophecies. So they were still looking for messiahs, which is why Jesus was saying, you're going to see these other people and they're going to look like they're fulfilling the expectations of what the Jews think the Messiah should do, but that's not me. And he was telling them ahead of time, yes, you have expectations and you want it to look a certain way, but that's not me. I'm telling you what's me, and you need to look for these signs, and then you'll know that I'm back. He was very practical, very down to earth, but he was also addressing their common tradition of their day that we don't know a whole lot about because it's been 2,000 years and it's not common knowledge anymore. But Jesus was talking about their expectations, basically. And we know that Josephus listed several stories about these false messiahs who would go out. Some, they looked like military leaders and they were firm and they called people out to the desert and they were going to fight. Well, then the Romans would kill them, or other people groups would kill them, and they would die and the people would scatter. Sometimes all the people would die. And Josephus listed about 5 or 6 of the different false messiahs that came about, and those stories are also recorded by Roman historians too, not just by Jewish people. But it was a cultural expectation. But Jesus said, don't be tempted because it's going to look this way. It's not going to look like what you think it's going to look like. So during this time when these false messiahs were rising up and the church was gaining steam and they were recording everything that they were doing, that's when the rebellion really took off. It was a couple of years later, after the kind of in the middle of when the Christians were being persecuted in Rome. The Jews were being persecuted by the Roman leadership inside the city. They were getting anxious and like even today you've got different types of people with different personalities and they don't always click. Well, you had the priests who were young and they were very zealous and they wanted to see God's kingdom set up and they were going to take it by force and all of that. So they were what we know of as the zealots, and they were just pushing the people out to resist Rome. And they thought that was the way the Messianic kingdom was going to be set up. So you had these zealous priests who were running things, But you also had the older and wiser priests who knew, okay, this isn't going to work. It's never worked before. You need to just lay low. Don't make it worse. God will take care of us. And so they had disagreements too. But they also, what made it bad was, like when Jesus was in the flesh and the governor, or part of his execution, was Pilate, okay? The governor of, during the time right before the war started, his name was Florus, and he's known as one of the worst that Jerusalem had seen. He was very evil. He would steal from them more than the others before him, and he always wanted to jab at them and hurt them and push their buttons, and he'd lie to them, and he'd throw them under the bus, and he'd tell Nero untrue things about him, and he was just provoking them a whole lot. Well, mixed with the zealous priests who wanted to see Rome overthrown anyway, it didn't work so well, and that the rebellion just kept gaining more and more steam by everybody in the city. Well, word got back to Nero, of course. And so Nero was like, okay, this needs to be stopped. Why don't we get a legion to go and take care of it, and we'll just squash it all. So Nero sent a commander named Cestius, and he was from north of Jerusalem in the Syrian area, and he was commander of the 12th Legion, who at the time wasn't put together very well, and Cestius knew it, but you can't really tell Nero what you're going to do. So he went anyway, even though he didn't feel very good about it. You just can't disobey Nero. So he started heading south to go and take care of this rebellion going on in Jerusalem. So let's look at some more things that Jesus said. In Matthew 24, verse 27 through 28, he said, "For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together." So Jesus wasn't just talking or pulling out things that would be familiar with our prophetic symbolism today, 2,000 years later. He was talking in language that those people could understand because, again, God cared about them and knew that a really bad time was coming, and he was doing everything he could to get them to repent and to watch for signs in order to keep them safe, because the message had to keep going through the generations and not just end with them. And that's what happened. Lightning refers to the emblem of the 12th Legion of Rome, which came with Cestius when Jerusalem was surrounded the first time. And this was in AD 66. So there was a couple of surroundings of Jerusalem, but the very first time that was a part of the main parts of the war, it was in the year 66. And Cestius, again, he was the commander of the 12th Legion, and this was their banner, and they had a lightning on it, and that was Jesus prophesying what the people needed to look for to know that it was time for them to leave. Another thing he said was about the eagles, and this had to do with Rome's Aquila, or an eagle, and each legion carried one eagle as their standard. So it was like everybody had this symbol, but each of the legions also had their own mascot, I guess, if you will. But they had the eagle and the lightning, and that was to indicate to the Christians what Jesus was talking about, and that was the time. Remember, he was saying, don't be gullible, don't fall for the false messiahs. They may sound like they're doing something good and they're powerful and they can take on Rome, but they're going to fall. It's not me. Watch for these signs. And this was a sign. Okay. Matthew 24, 15 through 16. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." He was telling them, again, what to look for to know when to get out. So this whole thing about an abomination of desolation, we kind of get hung up on it. And I think that our traditions have created this whole other definition, and we've turned it into something that it really wasn't supposed to be. It was just another indicator for the people to know what to watch for. So the root words, abomination, is from Strong's number 8262, shakats, meaning to be filthy, to loathe, pollute, or make abominable. This word was used in Old Testament verses describing pagan gods. But the word desolate, shamem, is Strong's number 8074, That means to stupefy, make amazed, to make desolate, and destroy and waste. So if you get hung up on the abomination of desolation, if you just switch it out, the filthy thing that comes to destroy you, you need to leave. Or if shakatz is meaning having to do with pagan gods, well, if you see the filthy thing that has to do with pagan gods and it looks like it's going to make you desolate, that's when you need to leave. So that's what he was saying. It's not, just untrain your brain a little bit to think of it in a different perspective. It has to do with pagan gods and it's going to kill you. So we definitely know that that's true of the Roman army, right? But Luke's version of it in 21:20, he says it plain. He says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. That's the parallel verse. It goes in the same context of what's described in Matthew 24, but Luke says the abomination of desolation, it's just when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And they were pagan armies, and they were going to kill them, and Rome was known for it, and that's when they knew that they had to leave. Okay, Cestius. In Wars of the Jews, Josephus explains what happened when Cestius finally showed up with the 12th Legion. He said, but now Cestius, observing that the disturbances that were begun among the Jews afforded him a proper opportunity to attack them, took his whole army along with him and put the Jews to flight. He pursued them to Jerusalem. The Romans made their attack against the wall for 5 days, but to no purpose. The people of the city took courage to admit Cestius as their benefactor, who, had he but continued the siege a little longer, had certainly taken the city, but it was, I suppose, owing to the aversion God had already at the city and the sanctuary, that he was hindered from putting an end to the war that very day. It then happened that Cestius recalled his soldiers from the place, and by despairing of any expectation of taking it, without having received any disgrace, he retired from the city without any reason in the world. So Cestius, he was chasing some Jews. They get to Jerusalem, and he attempted to get into the city for 5 days, and the people would have admitted him. They would have yielded, some of them, not all of them. But he tried for 5 days, and then he just changed his mind, and he left. And Josephus said he had no reason for it. He just left. Well, if God was saying that he was going to give the Christians an opportunity to see the symbols and everything and then get out of the city so that they could escape the tribulation coming, well, of course he's going to turn around and leave, because that was God's way of making it clear to the people that the city was about to be destroyed and they had to get out, because he loved them enough to do something like that. And so to me, that's of course why he did it. The people needed to remember Jesus's warnings for their benefit. Okay, Eusebius, he was a church historian a couple of hundred years after all this went down. So it was in more recent history for Eusebius compared to what we have now, because it's been about 2,000 years. But Eusebius, he wrote the church history. He said, but the apostles traveled into every land, teaching their message in the power of Christ, who had told them, go and make disciples of all nations in my name. Meanwhile, before the war began, members of the Jerusalem church were ordered by an oracle given by revelation to those worthy of it to leave the city and settle in a city of Perea called Pella. Here they migrated from Jerusalem as if, once holy men had deserted the royal capital of the Jews in the whole land of Judea, the judgment of God might finally fall on them for their crimes against Christ and his apostles, utterly blotting out all that wicked generation. Eusebius was recording what was more commonly known to them, that the people were told by revelation that God probably sent a prophet. They reminded them about what Jesus said in Matthew 24, but they were given more direct orders. Hey, Pella is a good place to go. Why don't you go there? So the church left Jerusalem after they saw Cestius surrounded and then turn around and leave for no reason, and they escaped. And so they saved their lives because God cared about them enough to direct their paths and guide where they were to go. So let's get back to, here's a map. If you see it, Judea and Jerusalem, they're down by the Dead Sea, but Pella went north, and that was their sanctuary city during the war. So they lived because they listened to Jesus. Another timeline, okay. In the year 66, the rebellion of the Jews began in the spring when the priests refused to perform the daily sacrifice for Caesar. Nero ordered Cestius to put a stop to what was happening in Jerusalem, and the Christians of the area fled to Perea. So it was about the year 66 where things really started taking off, got a whole lot harder for the Jews, but it was the time of the system being stopped. It had been one biblical generation, and God needed it to go because the new way of doing things was he was going to do it in us and through us as his vessels, okay? So when Cestius turned around, of course, he was ashamed. The honorable thing to do at that time was to take your life, and so that's what Cestius did because he was ashamed for being defeated, and there was no actual real battle. But Vespasian, this was the time when he rose up. It was transitioning out of the Claudian dynasty, the first 7 heads, and this was when Vespasian rose up in Judea as the 2-headed beast. He, though, instead of coming to attack Jerusalem like Cestius did, Vespasian realized that Jerusalem was a big fortress that he couldn't take down very easily. So his tactic was to start in all the areas in the cities surrounding Jerusalem and to take them out and to slowly chip away at the Jewish people as a whole and not start off right away with Jerusalem. So this is when he started rising up and doing it that way, doing it a little bit different. And during these years, it was about 3 years that Judea was gradually conquered by Vespasian and his son Titus. This was when Rome transitioned out of its first 7 Caesars into the new dynasty of the Flavians, and Jerusalem was weakened through famine and the internal fighting of 3 groups. And this was prophesied, which we're going to talk about in more detail in another session, but this was in Revelation 16:19. Now the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. So it said that the city, which was the harlot and Babylon, it was divided into 3 parts. And that was definitely the case. That can be proven in history. But again, we're going to get into more of that a little bit later. The next timeline. After these 3 years, Titus surrounded Jerusalem early in the year 70. The temple was burned 5 months later on the anniversary of when Babylon destroyed it the first time. So what happened with that was a few years before, Josephus was he was a Jewish leader that was captured, and he worked closely with Titus and Vespasian. He recorded things and he filled them in on details because he knew the ins and the outs of how to defeat the cities. And so the Romans took advantage of the Jews through people like Josephus. But he told them that Babylon destroyed their temple the first time in the year 586. And so Titus, on purpose, he was like, he could have taken it, but then he changed his mind and he put it off for a few days or maybe a week so that he could do it on the exact anniversary of when Babylon did it the first time. So when you see in the book of Revelation that the harlot or the great city or Jerusalem, they're calling it Babylon, that is another code for the people to realize that their temple was going to be destroyed because Babylon did it the first time. And now it was happening again, just like it did the last time, and they were refusing to see it and acknowledge it, and they were going to go down with it. So when you see Babylon, that is a reference to the history that the Jews were very familiar with, and they knew what was coming. But again, they would rather cling to the system and instead of the new ways that God was setting it up. So 73 AD was the final siege in Judea, and that was against the town of Masada. The entire rebellion lasted 7 years, and after this point, it was pretty much done. It was just the cleanup. The Jews were taken as slaves, and it was over after that battle. So it was a 7-year war. The temple was burned at about the halfway point. I also do want to point out that Matthew 24, okay, that is the only version in the gospel that has all of the parables at the end. After the prophecies, Matthew has these stories and parables like the sheep and the goats and all of that we cling to help us know who the empires that we need to be on guard against today are, and we use those parables. But Mark and Luke, they don't have those parables. They kind of end with the prophecies, and then they move on to other parts of the Jesus story. We need to keep that in mind and not try to fit it into creating the doctrine that we want to create. Matthew was probably most definitely a Jewish writer because he pulled in a whole lot more Jewish cultural information, where Mark and Luke were probably Gentiles and they didn't have the Jewish traditions the way that the book of Matthew did. And that was a part of their culture. It was Matthew's way to put in more parables, and that was to help explain a little bit more in a Jewish way what Jesus had just said in Matthew 24 and even Matthew 23 and what was coming. It was just going into more detail, repeating it in a different way and more of a symbolic form, what Jesus was talking about. And if we take it out of context, then I don't personally think that's okay. But there is a difference in the gospel versions, and Matthew is the only one that has those stories. Okay, so we talked about the harlot as a villain. We talked about the abomination of desolation that was a villain. We're going to do one more thing to talk about the villain of the idea of the end of the world. So it's not like a person, it's not a character in the book of Revelation, but it is something that is really harming the church today because it's holding us back because we're afraid of this whole fiery end to the planet, which is what we think, a lot of Christians think that the book of Revelation is doing. It's talking about this end of the planet right around the time that Jesus returns, before or after, and all of that. Let's look at Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all of these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So if you look at chapter 23, it's all about Jesus coming against the system and the leaders of the system. He was coming against the Pharisees and how corrupt they are. And the temple is all associated with that. So 24 is talking about the temple itself and everything that they're supposed to look for. But if you look at the parallel verses of these verses, 1 through 3 in Matthew 24, the parallel verses in Mark and Luke. Mark is 13:4. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of when all these things will be fulfilled? Luke 2:21-7 says, so they asked him, saying, Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? There's nothing here that Mark and Luke talk about that talk about the end of the age. Matthew's version of this has 3 questions. Let's go back and look. Let me go back there real quick. It says, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? He's asking 3 questions, where Mark and Luke, they don't. They only have the 2 questions. Again, that is because Matthew was a Jewish guy. Mark and Luke weren't. They were more Gentile. They were getting more into the facts. They didn't go into as many details. So I'm going to read a quote of part of my book because I said it how I want to say it, so I may as well read it, right? I said that the Greek word used for world in this verse is aeon, and this is from Matthew's version of it. Aeon is for world, which is translated eon, era, or age, and that is Strong's number 165. If the disciples would have been asking when the end of the planet was, they may have used the Greek word cosmos, or Strong's number 2889. But that was not even on their radar. To them, what Jesus was talking about was the way of life as they knew it. The temple system was what they lived and breathed. It was their foundation, and to remove it really was the end of the world. They were asking about the temple, but because the disciples were saying, whoa, this is the end of the world. Well, no, it wasn't the end of the planet. It was the end of the age. And they knew that too, because I don't think that they were caught off guard, because it was starting to dawn on them that Jesus really was changing everything. Okay, well, maybe it involved the temple system too. And so that was the end. It was the end of their world and their way. but Jesus was coming against the system that the people depended on. It wasn't him. He was coming against the system, but that was their world. The system was their world and their way of life. Okay, let's look at Matthew 24:14. And this is another belief that needs to be corrected. It says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." This is this whole thought about before the end that Jesus is prophesying about. Every single person in the world has to be told about Jesus, and they have to agree and hear him, and then the end will come. Okay, but Strong's number 3625 is oikomene, and that is the word used for world in that verse, and it means the land or the terrain part of the globe, specifically the Roman Empire. It was the earth and the world that was in charge at that time. It's like a first world definition of world and not the planet world. And we get our word ecumenical today from this. It's like the main primary leading part of the world. And that's what Jesus was saying, that it had to do more with society, the main part of society leading that was a part of what was happening during their time. So there are 3 verses. Here's just 3. There's more than 3 that use that word from Strong's number 3625 to mean Roman Empire. So let's take a look at other instances when that was used. Romans 10:18 says, "But I say, have they not heard? Yes, indeed, their sound has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the Roman Empire." It doesn't say world, it doesn't say planet, all of it. It just means that the main part where society is functioning, the main part of the land, that's where their words have gone out to. Hebrews 2:5, "For he has not put the Roman Empire to come, of which we speak, in subjection to angels." Luke 2:1 says, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the Roman Empire should be taxed." Those are just instances where our English translation says world, but that's not exactly the message that they were trying to get across. It was just the main part of the world at that time, if that makes sense. In the book of Revelation, if you look at the English words in most translations, it was only, the word world was only used 7 times in the book of Revelation. Some of it meant cosmos, like planet, all of that. Sometimes it meant land or soil, but there were 3 verses in Revelation where our English word world is used, but it was the word oikomene, just like what I'm saying here, the word Roman Empire, not cosmos, not land. So let's look at those 3. There's 3. Revelation 3:10. "Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole Roman Empire to test those who dwell on the earth." Also Revelation 12:9. "So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole Roman Empire. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." This doesn't mean that the devil or the Satan described in Revelation in the whole book, he didn't go out to deceive the planet. That this, in context, was talking about the devil going down to the Roman Empire to deceive them. Revelation 16:14. "For they are spirits of demons, performing signs, which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole Roman Empire, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty." You know, our English word world, it really restricts things, and we know that. And even non-Christian people say that the English language is very difficult and it's restrictive, and we're kind of pulling from other languages, and sometimes it's not very clear. But when this word world is used in these scary verses of the Bible, it does make it difficult, and we do have the temptation to create new doctrines when we really shouldn't. That if we can do some word studies and take them back to the original things that the authors were possibly saying, it keeps us on course a little bit to not get taken off to believe that God is saying things that he's really not. And this word world, it really does that. It restricts. You know, we have other words that we've done word studies that the church has, in our recent history, like the word. There's the Logos word, there's the Rhema word. And when we use those type of labels, it helps us keep in perspective what we're talking about. Whether you're talking about the Bible or you're talking about what God says. It's the same thing with the world. We need to know that there's a little bit more meant by it. And if we look at the root words to help us guide it, we can keep the things in different sections of the Bible, keep it in a better perspective. So Jesus, he didn't say that mass destruction would come to the planet. He wasn't saying that. He was saying that destruction would come to the main part of the world at the time, the world leaders, the first world area, that's what they needed to be on guard against. And the whole region, that empire, they would hear about him. And that's what Jesus was promising. It wasn't about every single person ever born on the planet. They would hear it. That's taking it a little too far. John never saw destruction coming. He never saw a Satan go into the entire planet and the whole cosmos and all the stars and all of that. He didn't see that. He was seeing trouble and demonic warfare coming to the Roman Empire, which is where they were working from and where they were spearheading everything from. That's what he was warning them against. And, if you look at it from that perspective, then yeah, the disciples did their job and they did the things that Jesus was encouraging them to do. They fulfilled the Great Commission before the day of the Lord came and before the tribulation came. They were a part of setting up the generations to come to walk in the power and live in the power and to remember what God did, because it was a new way of doing things. The temple was gone. It wasn't needed anymore. The new covenant had come. Jesus did everything that he ever said that he would do, the way that he said he would do it. And I think that it's time our generation recognizes that and we give him all the credit and we start getting rid of some of the filters so that when he speaks and he tells us of things personally in our lives and corporately, we're equipped for it and prepared for it. And that's the point of my book. It's my passion, is to say we owe Jesus everything and he finished it. He's done it all. And so we're going to keep going. That's a lot of the villains so far of the whole end time thinking thing. And we have a few more villains to talk about before we get into what the villains did. And that's going to be the purpose of next week's session. We're going to get into the dragon and the really bad guys who kind of puppeted the other bad guys. We're going to take a look at them and start tearing down even more traditions of some things that are holding back the church today. So if you guys have any questions, shoot me an email. It's pmtjennifer@yahoo.com. And I'll try and answer whatever questions. Even if I can't answer them during the class, I'll be sure and email you back. And my Facebook page is Revelation Through History. So we'll see you guys in the next session. Thanks. Bye.